Welcome, curious minds, to the Deep Dive. Think of our show as your personal study hall for bills on the Hill. Today, we're plunging into the fascinating, sometimes complex, world of big government bills.
Yeah, those huge pieces of legislation that, might sound a bit dry, but they actually shape so much around us.
Exactly. Everything from your family's finances to how elections are run. And when it comes to big bills, few get talked about as much as H.R. 1.
That's a great way to put it. In the U.S. House of Representatives, when a new session starts, they often give that number, H.R. 1, to the bill they see as their absolute top priority.
It's like giving it the pole position in a race, right?
Pretty much. It signals this is a legislative powerhouse they really, really want to get across the finish line.
Okay, let's unpack this right away because, well, here's where it gets really interesting. Our sources actually cover two different really significant bills that have both carried that H.R. 1 label.
Right. It can be a little confusing.
Yeah, but we're here to make it clear. So one version of H.R. 1 is widely known as the For the People Act. And that one is mostly focused on things like voting rules, protecting our elections from interference, and setting clear rules for good behavior, ethics for people in government.
It's fundamentally about the mechanics of democracy, really.
Exactly, strengthening our democracy.
And then there's the other H.R. 1. This is the massive bill that our sources really dive deep into for today's discussion.
Okay.
This one's, well, it's huge. It includes a whole section called Title VII Finance.
Title VII Finance, got it.
And this title is absolutely packed with proposed changes. We're talking taxes, finance rules, even healthcare policies.
Wow.
You could almost think of it like a legislative sequel to earlier tax laws, trying to reshape a lot across the economy, often with a focus on, say, fairness and boosting things domestically.
Right. So today's mission for our deep dive is specifically into that second huge H.R. 1, and we're putting a laser focus on its Title VII Finance.
Makes sense.
We're going to explore how these proposed changes might influence everything from, like, your family's budget and healthcare access, and maybe touch on some of the deeper implications, too. So let's jump in.
Okay, so before we get into the weeds, maybe just a quick groundwork point. When Title VII Finance talks about making changes, it's almost always referring to updates within something called the Internal Revenue Code of 1986.
Okay, the big tax rule book.
Exactly. Think of it as the gigantic master rulebook for all tax laws in the U.S. So anytime this bill mentions amending or repealing a section, it just means they're changing a specific part of that big book. It helps standardize how new rules get interpreted and applied.
Gotcha. Like updating the operating system for taxes. So within Title VII Finance, we start with Subtitle A. Lots of key tax provisions here, right?
That's right. Tacked with them.
Let's start with some proposed changes to credits for families and individuals. What's happening with the child tax credit?
Okay, for the child tax credit, the bill proposes a pretty straightforward but significant change. To claim the credit, taxpayers would need to include the child's Social Security number, their SSN, on the tax return.
Okay.
And if it's a joint return filing together, at least one of the parents or taxpayers would need their SSN on there too.
And the thinking behind that is?
It's really about ensuring accurate eligibility, making sure the credit goes to the right people and, preventing misuse. Looking ahead, the bill also mentions the maximum refundable amount of this credit would be adjusted for inflation after 2024.
So its value would keep up with rising costs.
Basically, yeah. So it doesn't lose its purchasing power over time.
That sounds practical. Okay, what about the retirement savings contributions credit? People call it the saver's credit, right? Saving for retirement seems far off for some of our listeners, but it's crucial.
Absolutely crucial. And this bill aims to boost that saver's credit sort of as an incentive for people to save more. It proposes increasing the maximum credit amount to $2,100.
$2,100.
Right. And that would apply to tax years starting after December 31st, 2026.
So what does that mean for, say, me or my family?
It means there's potentially a bigger incentive, a bigger tax break for putting money away for retirement. Especially helpful for lower and middle income folks to start saving early. It encourages that long-term financial planning.
Encouraging good habits early. Always good. Now, the paid family and medical leave credit. This sounds like it could really affect working families and how businesses operate.
Indeed. This part of the bill would let employers choose an applicable percentage, basically, a portion of the wages they pay to employees who are on family and medical leave, and take that as a tax credit.
So the government helps businesses pay for leave.
In a way, yes. The goal is pretty clear. Encourage more employers to offer paid leave. That's a huge support for employees dealing with, personal illness or family health issues.
Makes sense.
The bill also clarifies what counts as a substantial and legitimate business reason for how an employer sets up their leave policy. It specifically says things like wage rates or job categories don't count.
So they can't deny leave just because someone has a certain job title or salary.
Right. It's trying to prevent discrimination there. But it could involve grouping employees for, like, administrative reasons.
Okay, defining the boundaries for fairness.
Precisely. And it also addresses how state and local leave laws fit in. If leave is already paid for or required by a state or local government, that would count towards the employer's total leave provided.
Okay.
But it would not be used when calculating the federal tax credit amount.
So no double dipping for the employer, but the state efforts are still recognized.
Exactly. It tries to balance federal incentives with what states are already doing. And interestingly, certain specific employees, like folks working on fishing vessels, are excluded from these rules, recognizing some industries are just different.
It's amazing how many layers there are, trying to weave federal and state policy together. Okay, so those are some key credits. Let's shift to new and modified deductions. First up, miscellaneous itemized deductions. I heard this section's getting a big overhaul.
That's right, a pretty big one. The bill proposes getting rid of most miscellaneous itemized deductions.
Most of them. So lots of those smaller write-offs people used to take might disappear.
That's the proposal. But there's one very significant exception.
Which is?
Educator expenses.
Oh, good. So support for teachers and coaches would continue, because they often spend their own money on supplies, right?
Yes, exactly. And the bill actually expands the definition of educator expenses. It would now include costs for coaches and also certain non-athletic instructional equipment.
Like what, maybe science lab stuff or art supplies?
Could be, yeah. And crucially, it would be without dollar limitations.
No cap. Wow.
Right, no cap. And it also changes the wording from expenses in the classroom to as part of instructional activity. That broadens the scope a bit.
That seems really helpful for educators, making it easier to cover those necessary costs.
That's the idea. Support them so they can better support students.
Okay, next deduction.
Yeah.
Overtime pay. This is a new one.
Brand new proposal, yeah. A new deduction would be allowed for what they call qualified overtime compensation.
So a tax break for working overtime hours.
Essentially, yes. The goal is to put more take-home pay in the pockets of workers who put in those extra hours.
But are there limits? Does everyone get it?
Good question. There are important limits. This deduction gets reduced or even eliminated entirely for taxpayers with higher adjusted growth incomes.
Like who?
For instance, it would start phasing out above $150,000 for single individuals and $300,000 for couples filing jointly.
Okay, so it's targeted.
Definitely targeted. And like the child tax credit, you'd need an SSN to claim it, and this particular deduction has an end date. It would terminate after December 31st, 2028.
So what's the takeaway here? It sounds like a tax break aimed at maybe middle-income workers who earn overtime, rewarding those extra hours.
I think that's a fair summary, directing the benefit to a specific segment of the workforce, particularly those who might rely more on overtime pay.
Okay, another new deduction, interest on qualified passenger vehicle loans.
Yeah, this one's interesting.
Wait, like interest on a regular car loan? I thought you couldn't usually deduct that for your personal car.
You're absolutely right. Normally, it's considered personal interest and isn't deductible. But this bill proposes a temporary change for tax years 2025 through 2028.
Okay, what's the change?
Interest paid on loans for certain personal use passenger vehicles.
Oh.
You know, cars, minivans, SUVs, pickup trucks, even motorcycles under a certain weight limit would not be treated as personal interest, meaning it could potentially be deducted.
Whoa. So you could deduct your car loan interest?
Potentially, yes. But there's a big catch.
Always a catch. What is it?
The vehicle has to be assembled in the United States.
Assembles in the USA. Okay, so for a few years, buying an American-made car could come with a deduction for the loan interest. That seems like a pretty big incentive.
It could be significant, yeah, both for buyers and for U.S. auto manufacturing.
Are there income limits on this one, too?
Yes, similar structure to the overtime deduction. It would also be phased out for higher earners, starts phasing out above $100,000 for individuals, $200,000 for joint filers.
Okay.
And for this to work practically, lenders would have to report this interest information to the IRS and also send a copy to the borrower.
So the goal seems twofold. Make U.S.-made cars cheaper for many people via the tax deduction and boost the U.S. auto industry.
That appears to be the clear intent, yes. A direct financial incentive tied to domestic production.
Fascinating. Okay, now let's talk about something called Trump accounts.
Yeah.
This sounds completely new. A savings vehicle for young people.
Yes, these are designed to function a bit like IRAs, individual retirement accounts, but they are specifically not Roth IRAs. They're created for individuals who haven't turned 18 yet and have an SSN.
So getting kids started saving early.
That's the idea, giving them a head start on financial security, potentially building assets from a young age. An election can be made by the Treasury Secretary or another person to get the account set up.
Interesting. What kind of investments can go into these accounts? Are they wide open or are there rules?
Very specific rules. That's a key part of the design. Funds in these Trump accounts could only be invested in certain mutual funds or ETFs, exchange-traded funds.
Okay.
They have to meet strict criteria. They need to track broad market indexes like the S&P 500 or other U.S. equity indexes, so no picking individual stocks.
Diversified market following.
Exactly. And they cannot use leverage borrowed money, making them less risky. They also have to have very low annual fees, less than 0.1%. And they can't be focused on just one industry or sector.
Wow, that's very prescriptive. It sounds like a really conservative, long-term approach, almost like guardrails for young investors.
That's a good way to put it. Guardrails. It guides them towards low-cost, diversified, long-term investing.
What about contributions? And when can the money actually be used?
There's an annual contribution limit of $5,000, and that can be adjusted for inflation over time. Some contributions don't count towards that limit, like rolling money over from another Trump account or contributions from a specific pilot program run by the Treasury Secretary.
Okay.
Generally, withdrawals from the account become taxable income once the beneficiary, the young person, turns 18.
And there's reporting involved.
Oh, yes. The trustee, the financial institution managing the account, has to send detailed reports to both the Treasury Secretary and the beneficiary. These reports would cover contributions, especially any large ones from outside sources, distributions, the account's value, and the total amount put in. Rollovers require a separate report pretty quickly, within 30 days.
And you mentioned a pilot program.
Yeah, there's a Trump Accounts Contribution Pilot Program specifically for kids born between 2025 and 2028 who are U.S. citizens. And, as you might expect, there are penalties if people provide false info or don't follow the SSN rules.
So what's really fascinating here? What's the big picture takeaway on these accounts?
It's a novel concept, right? A completely new type of savings account aimed squarely at young people. It's structured to nudge them towards specific types of investments, diversified, low fee maybe, to help build long-term savings from a really early age and perhaps instill good financial habits. It's an interesting policy experiment.
Definitely sounds like it. Okay, shifting gears now to business and industry-specific changes. Let's start with research and experimental, or R&E, expenditures. How might this affect innovation?
It could have a pretty significant impact, actually. The bill proposes to change how businesses deduct their R&E expenses. Previously, companies could often deduct these costs immediately, getting the full tax benefit right away.
Okay, and the changes.
Now, domestic R&E expenses research done here in the U.S. would have to be amortized.
Amortized, meaning spread out.
Exactly, spread out over 5 years. And for foreign R&E expenses, research done outside the U.S., it's spread out over 15 years.
15 years, wow. So what does this mean for a company investing heavily in, say, developing new tech?
Well, it could significantly change how they budget for innovation. Spreading the deduction out means it becomes more costly up front, right? It affects their immediate cash flow. It might make companies think twice about certain long-term research projects, especially those done overseas.
So less of an immediate tax break for doing research.
That's the effect, yes. There are some transition rules for small businesses, allowing them to potentially apply changes retroactively and deduct remaining amounts faster, but the overall shift is towards slower cost recovery for R&E.
That's a big shift in incentives. Okay, what about qualified production property?
This introduces a new deduction. It's for a portion of non-residential real property, think buildings, factories that are used in what they call qualified production activities.
So a tax break for building or using factories for certain types of production here.
That's the idea. Incentivizing specific types of domestic production and the investment in the physical infrastructure needed for it. There's also a special rule that property not used that way between early 2021 and mid-2025 could still qualify under certain conditions.
Trying to boost domestic manufacturing infrastructure. Got it. Next, opportunity zones. These have been around for a bit, designed to bring investment into struggling communities using tax breaks, right?
Exactly. The bill proposes extending the designation period for these qualified opportunity zones, or QOZs, until the end of 2026. It also tweaks how low-income communities are defined for eligibility using new income and poverty criteria. And it removes a rule about needing to be next to another low-income area.
So, refining how the zones are picked. What about oversight? There's been some criticism about whether the investments are truly helping the communities they're supposed to.
That's a key focus here. The bill introduces new, stricter annual filing requirements for the qualified opportunity funds that handle these investments, including special rules for rural opportunity funds.
No kind of reporting.
Much more detailed reports. They'd have to report on the specifics of their investments, property values, how many employees are involved, the types of businesses being supported within the zone.
More transparency.
A lot more. And there are hefty penalties, $500 per day for failing to file complete and correct returns. Plus, electronic filing would be mandatory.
So the takeaway is, while opportunity zones aim to help distressed areas, these changes are about making sure the zones are chosen carefully and that the investments are much more transparent and accountable.
Precisely. Refining the program and adding significant oversight.
Transparency again. Okay, spaceports. This sounds futuristic, but it's real business now. How does the bill treat them?
Yeah, not sci-fi anymore. The bill proposes treating spaceports much like airports when it comes to something called exempt facility bonds.
Exempt facility bonds.
Yeah.
Those allow for cheaper financing, right? Tax exempt.
Correct. It allows projects to be financed with bonds where the interest paid to bondholders isn't taxed by the federal government, which lowers borrowing cost.
And what counts as a spaceport here? Just the launch pad?
It's defined pretty broadly. A facility near a launch or re-entry site used for manufacturing spacecraft, flight control, launch or re-entry services, or transferring crew and cargo. Interestingly, it doesn't have to be open to the general public to qualify.
So what's the impact? Making it easier to build space infrastructure.
That's the goal. It could make it significantly easier and cheaper to build and expand things like launch facilities, manufacturing plants, control centers, all the infrastructure needed to support the growing commercial space industry here in the U.S. It's a clear boost for that sector.
Supporting a key future industry. Okay, Qualified Small Business Stock, QSBS. Sounds like this is aimed at helping startups and small businesses get investment.
It is. The bill proposes changes to how much of the profit or gain you can exclude from taxes when you sell qualified small business stock. This applies especially to stock acquired after the bill is enacted.
How does it change?
Well, it creates a potentially higher exclusion percentage, up to 75% tax-free gain for investments in certain types of small businesses, specifically those primarily located in minority communities or rural areas.
So targeting investment towards underserved areas.
Seems like it. And the total dollar amount of gain you can exclude also goes up for stock bought after the bill passes from $10 million potentially up to $15 million.
So the idea is to make investing in small businesses, especially in specific communities, more attractive by offering a bigger tax break when the investment pays off.
Exactly. A significant tax incentive to encourage venture capital and other investments into smaller, growing companies with a particular focus on certain geographic or demographic areas.
Got it. Now, this next one sounds really important, especially with global supply chains being such a focus. Clean energy credits, prohibited foreign entities.
Yes, this is a critical provision, really highlighting national security and domestic economic goals within climate policy. Several key clean energy tax credits.
Like which ones?
Things like the Clean Electricity Investment Credit, the Advanced Manufacturing Production Credit for making solar panels or batteries, and the Clean Fuel Production Credit. All of these would have new restrictions.
Restrictions based on?
Based on whether the taxpayer claiming the credit is considered a prohibited foreign entity.
Okay, that sounds specific. What exactly is a prohibited foreign entity?
It's defined pretty carefully. It can mean a specified foreign entity, which includes governments or entities connected to certain foreign countries, often those seen as adversaries or competitors.
Right.
But it also includes something called a foreign-influenced entity. And this is where it gets complex.
Oh, so?
A foreign-influenced entity is broadly defined as one where foreign individuals or governments have effective control, even if they don't own a majority stake.
Effective control. Like through contracts or something?
Yeah, exactly. It could be through licensing agreements that dictate how technology is used, contractual rights to direct the company's operations, or even the power to limit how intellectual property is used. It can also apply to publicly traded companies if certain foreign entities have the power to appoint officers or own own a significant chunk, say 25% of the company.
Wow. So what's the big picture here? Why is this fascinating?
It's fascinating because it shows a very strong focus on preventing foreign influence, particularly from certain countries, over critical U.S. clean energy infrastructure and manufacturing. It's an attempt to ensure that American tax dollars, through these credits, are primarily supporting domestic interests, domestic jobs, and national security in the transition to clean energy. It's about who builds and controls our green future.
Making sure the benefits stay here, basically.
And that critical infrastructure isn't unduly influenced from abroad, and there are teeth to enforce this. There are penalties for providing inaccurate or false information about these foreign entity connections, a base penalty of $5,000 or 10% of the tax credit underpayment.
They mean business on this one.
Clearly.
Okay, let's quickly touch on a couple more technical business tax items. Sourcing of inventory income and GILTI, and publicly traded partnerships. These sound pretty specialized.
They are definitely more in the weeds for large corporations. The bill changes rules for how income from selling inventory made in the U.S. is sourced, which country gets to tax it. That affects multinational companies. And GILTI, Global Intangible Low-Taxed Income, gets renamed and its calculation tweaked.
Okay. And publicly traded partnerships.
It updates the rules about what kind of income qualifies for these partnerships, specifically adding things related to mining, processing, or marketing minerals and natural resources, including, interestingly, industrial carbon dioxide. It also refines what counts as qualifying transportation or storage activities.
So technical adjustments affecting how large corporations, especially in energy and resources, are structured and taxed.
Pretty much. Significant for them, but maybe less direct impact on individuals.
Got it. How about excessive employee remuneration? This sounds like it targets high executive pay.
It does. There's already a rule limiting the tax deduction companies can take for executive pay over $1 million for certain top officers. This bill proposes to expand that limitation.
How so?
It would apply the limit more broadly to controlled groups of corporations, basically, making it harder for related companies within a larger corporate structure to get around the $1 million deduction cap for highly paid employees across the group.
So tightening the rule to limit tax benefits for very high executive salaries.
That's the aim, reducing the tax subsidy for multi-million-dollar compensation packages.
Okay. Now, let's shift to another big theme. Increased transparency and oversight in finance. We saw this with opportunity zones, and it seems to pop up elsewhere too, starting with third-party network transactions, those 1099-K forms. Lots of people doing online sales got a surprise with recent rule changes.
Yes, that $600 reporting threshold caused a lot of confusion and concern. This bill proposes to change it back.
Back to what?
Back to the older, much higher threshold. Under this bill, reporting for payment card and third-party network transactions, think online marketplaces like eBay, Etsy, or payment apps, would only be required if the total payments exceed $20,000 and there are more than 200 transactions in a year.
Wow, back to $20,000 and 200 transactions. That's a huge difference from $600.
A very big difference. It means far fewer people doing casual online selling or having small side businesses would get those 1099-K forms. It significantly reduces the reporting burden for smaller scale sellers.
That will be a relief for many people.
No.
Okay, remittance transfer fees. What's this about? Sending money overseas.
Exactly. This proposes a new fee, a 0.5% fee on remittance transfers, which is sending money to foreign countries, but only if the amount is $500 or more.
A fee on sending money home. Are there exceptions?
Yes, some important ones. The fee wouldn't apply if the money is withdrawn directly from an account at an insured bank or credit union, or if it's funded using a U.S.-issued debit or credit card.
So it's a new tax specifically on certain ways of sending money internationally, over $500. Could affect families supporting relatives abroad.
It certainly could, depending on how they send the money. It's a way to generate revenue from those international flows.
Interesting. And COVID, ERTC promoter penalties.
Sounds like cleaning up after a past program.
ERTC was the Employee Retention Tax Credit during the pandemic, right?
Correct. It was a valuable program, but unfortunately it attracted some questionable actors and fraudulent claims. This bill introduces penalties specifically targeting individuals or firms who aggressively marketed or provided bad advice related to the ERTC.
How does it define these promoters?
It defines a COVID ERTC promoter based on meeting certain gross receipts thresholds from providing that kind of advice, unless they're a certified professional employer organization. It also penalizes them if they didn't perform proper due diligence or if fraud was involved in the claims they helped prepare.
So cracking down on those who exploited the system, that's the clear goal. Holding promoters accountable for bad advice and fraudulent claims related to the ERTC.
Makes sense. Lastly, under this subtitle, a study on free tax filing programs. This sounds potentially huge for taxpayers.
It could be. The bill directs the Treasury Secretary to conduct a comprehensive study on free tax filing options for Americans.
What would the study look at?
A bunch of things. The cost of potentially expanding public-private partnerships to offer free filing to maybe 70% of taxpayers. What taxpayers actually think about government-run versus private free services. The feasibility of totally new approaches. And critically, the cost and complexity of developing and running a free, direct e-file system run by the government itself.
A government-run free file system. That's been talked about for years.
It has. This study would look at the nitty-gritty, how much it would cost, who it could serve based on income or complexity. So this highlights a real interest in making tax filing easier, less costly, and potentially free for many more Americans. It could fundamentally change tax season for millions.
That would be a welcome change indeed. Okay, that wraps up the dense Subtitle A on taxes and finance. Now let's move into Subtitle B, healthcare-related provisions. This touches on Medicaid quite a bit, right?
Yes, several significant Medicaid-related items here. First, there's a Medicare Savings Program moratorium.
What does that mean?
It basically prevents certain rules related to eligibility for the Medicare Savings Program, which helps low-income seniors and people with disabilities pay for Medicare costs from being implemented until September 30, 2034. It pauses changes that might affect who qualifies.
Providing some stability there. What about address and death verification for Medicaid?
This requires states to step up their game in verifying where beneficiaries live and confirming if they've passed away. They'd need to use reliable data sources like the Postal Service's address database or info from managed care plans to check addresses.
And for deaths?
Use data from the Social Security Administration and other states. The goal is pretty straightforward. Stop payments for deceased individuals promptly and also be able to quickly reinstate coverage if a mistake was made. It's about program integrity, making sure payments are accurate, and preventing fraud or waste.
Efficiency and accuracy. Makes sense. And erroneous payments more broadly.
The bill puts limits on waivers for states that make too many incorrect payments, aiming for a very low error rate target, just 0.03%. Again, tightening the screws on accuracy in Medicaid spending.
Okay. How about home equity limits for Medicaid? This sounds important for families facing long-term care needs.
It could be very important. Currently, there are limits on how much home equity someone can have and still qualify for Medicaid to pay for long-term care, like nursing homes. This bill would give states the option to allow much higher limits, up to $1 million, especially for non-farm homes.
$1 million. So more people could potentially keep their homes and still get Medicaid for long-term care.
That's the potential effect, yes. It could prevent some people from having to sell their family home to qualify for needed care if the state chooses to adopt this higher limit. It offers more protection for a significant family asset.
That could ease a huge burden for families in difficult situations. Then there's alien Medicaid eligibility. What's changing there?
The bill proposes amendments related to Medicaid eligibility for non-citizens, described as aliens in the text. It implies there will be further specific rules or adjustments regarding how non-citizens qualify for Medicaid services. The details aren't fully spelled out here, but it signals a change in that area.
Okay. And a minimum staffing standards moratorium for long-term care facilities, delaying staffing rules.
Yes. This would put a moratorium, on implementing any federal minimum staffing standards for nursing homes and other long-term care facilities until September 30, 2027.
So any new rules requiring more staff per resident would be pushed back.
Correct. It delays the enforcement of those potential new standards for several years, perhaps giving facilities more time to hire or adjust, but also meaning those higher staffing levels wouldn't be federally mandated right away.
Got it. Now, this next one, federal payments to prohibited entities, sounds like it targets specific types of healthcare providers and can be quite controversial.
This is indeed a provision that touches on highly debated social issues. It proposes to prohibit both federal and state Medicaid payments from going to certain nonprofit organizations.
Which organizations?
Specifically, 501c nonprofits that are also considered essential community providers, primarily focused on family planning or reproductive health, and that provide abortion services with exceptions for cases of rape, incest, or to save the mother's life.
Okay. Is there a threshold?
Yes, the prohibition applies if the organization received more than $800,000 in Medicaid funds in fiscal year 2023.
So this directly addresses the funding of certain clinics, like Planned Parenthood potentially, and could significantly impact their ability to operate using Medicaid funds.
That's the clear implication and intent. It would cut off a major funding source for organizations that meet these specific criteria, impacting not just abortion services, but potentially a wide range of other health services they provide to Medicaid recipients, like cancer screenings, contraception, and STI testing. It's a policy choice with significant consequences for those providers and the patients they serve.
A very pointed policy change,
Right.
reflecting a specific viewpoint on that issue. Okay, moving on. Provider taxes.
This adjusts some technical rules related to healthcare taxes that states sometimes impose on hospitals or other providers to help fund the state's share of Medicaid costs. It changes thresholds for what are called hold harmless provisions, effective in late 2026. It's about how states can structure these taxes without negatively impacting providers unduly.
Technical state financing stuff. And state-directed payments.
This revises rules about how states can direct extra Medicaid payments to certain providers. The change here specifically benefits rural hospitals, including critical access hospitals and sole community hospitals. It gives states more flexibility to financially support struggling hospitals in rural areas.
Helping keep rural health care afloat. Makes sense. Medicaid demonstration project waivers.
This just clarifies that when the federal government grants waivers for states to try out experimental Medicaid programs, these pilot projects shouldn't end up costing the federal government more money than the standard Medicaid program would have. It's about ensuring fiscal neutrality for these innovations.
Okay. Now, community engagement requirements. This is often called work requirements for Medicaid, right?
Right.
Another potentially huge change.
Yes, this is a very significant policy shift. Starting after the end of 2026, this bill would give states the option to require applicable individuals to meet certain community engagement requirements to stay eligible for Medicaid.
Community engagement. What does that mean in practice?
Generally, it means participating in specific activities for at least 80 hours per month.
What kind of activities?
Things like working a job, doing community service, being in a work training program, or being enrolled at least half-time in school or vocational training.
So basically, work, train, volunteer, or go to school to keep your Medicaid if you fall into the applicable individual group.
That's the core idea.
Are there exceptions? Surely not everyone can meet an 80-hour monthly requirement.
Yes, there are mandatory exceptions. For example, people with certain health conditions making work difficult, individuals under 19, people getting unemployment benefits, pregnant individuals, and inmates wouldn't be subject to the requirements.
Okay.
States could also choose to grant optional temporary exceptions for hardships like a serious illness, domestic violence situations, homelessness, natural disasters, or if someone lives in an area with extremely high unemployment where finding work is nearly impossible.
And states would check on this.
They'd have to verify compliance when people's eligibility is redetermined. And importantly, the bill states these requirements cannot be waived by the Federal Secretary of Health and Human Services. If a state adopts them, they're meant to stick.
So why is this important? What's the potential impact?
It's hugely important because it could significantly change who qualifies for Medicaid in states that implement it. Proponents argue it connects recipients to work and promotes self-sufficiency. Opponents worry it will cause many eligible people, especially those facing barriers to work or documentation, to lose essential health coverage. It's a fundamental shift tying health benefits to work-related activities for certain groups.
A really big shift with potentially widespread consequences.
Okay.
Moving away from Medicaid specifically, let's look at the health insurance premium tax credit and HSAs. How might the premium tax credit change? That's the credit that helps people buy insurance on the ACA marketplaces, right?
Correct. The bill proposes expanding the definition of who qualifies as an eligible alien for these credits. It would broaden eligibility to include lawfully admitted permanent residents, green card holders, and other lawfully present non-citizens who are expected to remain lawfully present.
So potentially more lawfully present immigrants could get help affording insurance.
That's the potential outcome, yes. However, it also specifies that the credit would be disallowed if someone is ineligible for Medicaid because of their alien status trying to coordinate between programs.
Okay, and verification.
Yes, the health insurance exchanges, the marketplaces, would be required to verify eligibility information more thoroughly, things like household income, family size, immigration status, and whether someone had prior health coverage. Again, program integrity focus.
Makes sense. Now, direct primary care service arrangements, or DPCAs, this sounds like a different model of healthcare.
It is. DPCAs are where patients pay a recurring fee, usually monthly, directly to a primary care doctor or clinic for a defined set of primary care services, often outside of traditional insurance.
Like a membership for basic healthcare.
Kind of, yeah. This bill defines these arrangements and gives them specific tax treatment. Importantly, the fees paid for a DPCA would be treated as medical expenses for tax purposes.
Meaning you could potentially pay for them with tax advantage money, like from a health savings account, HSA, or deduct them.
Exactly. That's a key change. It makes DPCAs potentially more affordable by allowing pre-tax dollars or deductions, subject to certain limits like $150 a month per person, or $300 if the arrangement covers more than one person.
Does it define what counts as primary care services under this model?
It does, and it also lists things that are specifically excluded, like procedures needing general anesthesia, most prescription drugs, and complex lab services. So it's focused on routine primary care.
So what's the significance here? Making this alternative model more viable?
That seems to be the goal. By giving it favorable tax treatment, it could make direct primary care more accessible and attractive for individuals seeking a different relationship with their primary care provider, often one with more direct access and less insurance hassle for basic needs.
Interesting. Okay, lastly, under healthcare, protecting rural hospitals and providers. This sounds like a targeted investment.
A very significant one. The bill establishes a new rural health transformation program.
With dedicated funding.
Yes, $200 million appropriated just for fiscal year 2025 to get it started. The funds would be distributed to states based on things like their rural population, the number of rural health facilities they have, and the financial health of their rural hospitals.
And what can states do with this money? What are the goals?
The goals are broad but focused on strengthening rural health care. States can use the funds to improve access and health outcomes for rural residents, use new technologies for prevention or managing chronic diseases, support partnerships between rural hospitals to improve quality and financial stability.
What else?
Enhance recruitment and training of healthcare workers for rural areas, support using data and tech to bring care closer to home, tackle opioid and mental health issues, and support innovative payment models like value-based care.
That's a comprehensive list.
Yeah.
Why is this specific focus on rural health so important?
Because rural areas often face really unique and severe challenges. Difficulty recruiting doctors and nurses, hospitals struggling financially due to lower patient volumes, long travel times for patients to get care. This program is a substantial investment aimed squarely at addressing those deep-seated problems and shoring up the healthcare safety net in rural America. It recognizes that access to care shouldn't depend so heavily on your zip code.
A vital investment for equity in healthcare access.
Okay.
Okay, that covers the healthcare subtitle. Now, briefly, subtitle C, unemployment compensation. There's a specific limitation on high wage earners here.
Yes, this is pretty direct. It proposes prohibiting federal funds from being used to pay unemployment benefits to individuals whose wages during their base period, the time used to calculate benefits, were $1 million or more.
$1 million or more in wages. So, no unemployment checks for very high earners.
That's the proposal. State agencies would need to implement self-certification forms and use wage verification systems. They'd also have to try and recover any overpayments made to such individuals.
That's the rationale here.
The underlying idea seems to be that federal unemployment funds are intended as a safety net for those with greater need, and that individuals earning over $1 million are less likely to require that specific form of public assistance during unemployment spells. It's a policy choice about resource allocation.
Targeting benefits based on income level. Got it. Finally, before we switch gears to the other H.R. 1, there's one more piece from this bill. Subtitle A of Title 8 Hell APS Committee. This one's about financial aid for college and exempting certain assets.
Right. This proposes amending the Higher Education Act of 1965. It's about how assets are treated when calculating a student's expected family contribution, or EFC, for federal financial aid.
What assets would be treated differently?
The bill would exempt certain family-owned assets from being counted in that calculation. Specifically, a family farm where the family lives, a small business with 100 or fewer full-time equivalent employees owned and controlled by the family, and a commercial fishing business.
So the value of the family farm or small business wouldn't count against the student when applying for federal aid like Pell Grants or subsidized loans.
Exactly. Currently, the value of these assets can sometimes significantly reduce the amount of aid a student receives, even if the family doesn't have much liquid cash.
So what does this mean for those families? It sounds like a big deal.
It could be huge. It aims to make it easier for families who own these types of businesses or farms to qualify for financial aid. It prevents them from being penalized for having assets tied up in their livelihood, assets they often can't just sell off to pay for tuition. It supports family enterprises and access to higher education simultaneously.
A big relief for families trying to balance running a business or farm with sending kids to college. Okay, wow. That was a deep dive into just one version of H.R. 1, specifically its Title VII finance and related parts. So many changes touching taxes, finance, healthcare, even education funding.
It's incredibly broad, covering so much ground.
But now let's widen our lens, because as we mentioned at the start, there's that other major bill, also famously known as H.R. 1, the For the People Act. This one tackles a whole different but equally fundamental set of issues, right?
Absolutely. While the bill we just discussed focuses heavily on finance and related policy, the For the People Act version of H.R. 1 zeroes in on the mechanics of American democracy itself, voting rights, election security, campaign finance, government ethics. It's about the structure and rules of our representative system.
Okay, so let's explore the key areas of this other H.R. 1. First, making voting easier and more secure. A big piece of this is automatic voter registration, or AVR. How would that actually work?
The idea behind AVR is to shift voter registration from an opt-in system, where you have to actively sign up, to an opt-out system. This bill would require states to automatically register eligible citizens to vote whenever they interact with certain government agencies, most commonly the DMV, but potentially others like social service agencies too.
So you get your driver's license, you automatically get registered to vote, unless you specifically say no.
That's the core concept, yes, a front-end opt-out. It also mandates using electronic systems to transfer that registration data securely and efficiently, getting rid of paper forms. It even requires states to do a one-time look-back to try and register eligible people already in their databases. Plus, it would let registered voters update their address easily right at the polling place on Election Day.
Why is this seen as such an important reform by its supporters?
The main goal is to make registration much simpler and more seamless, removing barriers that prevent people from voting. Proponents argue it could significantly increase voter participation by making registration almost universal for eligible citizens who interact with the state. It's about maximizing access.
Making it easier to get on the rolls. What about access specifically for individuals with disabilities? Are there specific protections there?
Yes. This bill includes strong provisions, often referred to as the Disability Voting Rights Act elements. It guarantees people with disabilities the right to use absentee voting for both registration and casting their ballot.
How would that work? More options.
States would have to offer accessible options for requesting registration forms and ballots by mail and electronically. They'd need to securely transmit blank absentee ballots electronically if requested. It also requires a single, accessible office for information and a dedicated email address for requests, simplifying the process.
And technology.
It encourages pilot programs using technology to allow for independent and private voting for people with disabilities, aiming for innovation that enhances autonomy. The overall goal is removing barriers, physical, communication, procedural, to ensure equal access and the ability to vote privately and independently.
Crucial for ensuring everyone can participate fully. Okay, democracy restoration. This addresses felony disenfranchisement, which is a really complex issue with deep historical roots.
It is. This part of the bill would restore federal voting rights to American citizens who have completed their sentences after being convicted of a felony.
So once someone has served their time, they automatically get their right to vote back in federal elections.
That's the proposal. The source material notes that current state laws on this vary wildly and disproportionately affect minority communities, sometimes stemming from laws enacted long ago with discriminatory intent. This aims to create a uniform national standard promoting reintegration into civic life after incarceration.
And it also mentions provisional ballots.
Yes, it includes rules to ensure that provisional ballots, those cast when there's uncertainty about a voter's eligibility at the polls, are counted for all the races the voter was actually eligible for. It also pushes for uniform, non-discriminatory standards for handling these ballots across the board. It's about making sure every valid vote counts.
Restoring rights and counting every vote. Okay, early voting. This has become much more common, hasn't it?
Very much so. This bill would mandate a minimum period for in-person early voting in federal elections across all states. It would require early voting to be available for at least 2 weeks before Election Day, including specified weekend and evening hours.
Why mandate it everywhere?
The rationale is that relying solely on Election Day voting can be a real hurdle for people with inflexible jobs, childcare responsibilities, or transportation issues. Early voting provides flexibility, reduces lines on Election Day, and generally makes casting a ballot more convenient. This aims to boost participation by offering more opportunities to vote.
Makes sense. More options, more voters, potentially. How about territorial voting rights? This affects U.S. citizens living in places like Puerto Rico or Guam.
Right. This expresses support for federal voting rights for Americans living in U.S. territories. Currently, citizens in these territories often can't vote for president and have limited or no voting representation in Congress. This bill would also set up a task force to study the specific barriers to voting these citizens face and recommend ways to overcome them. It brings attention to the democratic rights of citizens outside the 50 states.
And finally, under voting access, Native American voting rights. What specific issues does this address?
It explicitly commits to protecting and promoting the voting rights of Native Americans. It acknowledges that Native communities often face unique and persistent obstacles.
Like what?
Things like discriminatory voter ID laws that don't account for tribal IDs, lack of adequate language assistance for tribal languages, and the sheer distance and lack of accessible registration and polling places on reservations or in remote areas. This section aims to ensure equal access by addressing these specific, systemic challenges faced by Native voters.
So a really comprehensive approach to expanding and protecting voting access across many different groups and situations. Now let's turn to election security. Foreign interference and hacking have been huge concerns.
Absolutely. This part of the bill focuses on hardening our election infrastructure against threats, both foreign and domestic. It includes providing significant financial support to states' grants to upgrade voting systems, enhance cybersecurity, and conduct post-election risk-limiting audits.
Risk-limiting audits, what are those?
They're a statistical method to check election results efficiently. Basically, you manually check a certain number of paper ballots to get high confidence that the reported outcome is correct, or to identify if a full recount is needed. It's about verifying the results rigorously.
Building trust through verification. What about intelligence and information sharing?
That's key, too. It would authorize the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, to streamline security clearances for state election officials so they can receive classified threat information more easily. It also requires regular reports from DHS and the Director of National Intelligence on foreign threats and information sharing efforts, keeping Congress and the states informed. The goal is a more coordinated national defense against election interference.
And the voting machines themselves.
The bill expands federal testing and certification requirements for voting machines and electronic poll books to improve their cybersecurity standards. And it directs the Election Assistance Commission, EAC, to study the impact of automated social media accounts, bots, on elections and public discourse, recognizing the threat of online disinformation campaigns.
So securing the physical machines, the digital networks, and trying to understand online manipulation too. Very comprehensive. Okay, next major area. Campaign finance transparency. Getting a clearer picture of money in politics.
Exactly. A major focus here is on identifying who is trying to influence elections. One provision requires campaigns and political committees to report contacts with foreign governments or their agents if those contacts involve offers of assistance or things of value related to the election.
A direct response to past election interference concerns?
Seems so. Then there's the Disclose Act portion, aimed squarely at dark money.
Okay, remind us what exactly is dark money.
It refers to election spending by certain types of nonprofit organizations or shell corporations that don't have to disclose their donors.
Yeah.
So voters see ads or mailers but have no idea who actually paid for them.
And this has been significant.
Very. The source material says over $1 billion in dark money has flooded federal elections since 2010, often targeting the most competitive races. The Disclose Act provisions would require these groups spending money on elections to reveal their major donors.
Pulling back the curtain.
Right.
It also aims to clarify rules banning foreign nationals from participating in campaign spending decisions, and extends disclosure requirements to spending on ads related to federal judicial nominations, too. The core idea is transparency, letting voters see who's trying to influence them.
So voters can judge the message knowing who funded it. What about online ads? The Honest Ads Act part.
This applies similar transparency principles to the digital world. It would require major online platforms, think Facebook, Google, etc., defined as having over 50 million monthly U.S. visitors to maintain public databases of political ads shown on their sites.
What information would be in these databases?
Things like who paid for the ad, a description of the audience targeted by the ad, how much it cost, when it ran, basically bringing online political ad disclosure up to par with rules for TV and radio ads.
And foreign influence online.
It also requires platforms to make reasonable efforts to ensure foreign nationals aren't illegally purchasing political ads. And it directs the FEC to study internet media literacy, recognizing people need skills to navigate online political information. Making online ads as transparent as traditional ones. Makes sense. Now, small donor public financing. This sounds like a really fundamental change to campaign funding.
It would be a massive change. This proposes creating a voluntary system for publicly financing campaigns for the House of Representatives.
Publicly funded campaigns, where would the money come from? Taxpayers.
No, that's a key point. The Freedom from Influence Fund would be funded through assessments on corporations and financial institutions that settle cases involving corporate wrongdoing, plus potentially voluntary contributions, no direct taxpayer appropriation.
Okay, and how would it work? Candidates opt in.
Candidates who choose to participate and meet certain qualifying thresholds by raising a number of small dollar donations would receive public matching funds, often at a high ratio, like 6-to-1, for those small contributions. In return, they'd agree to contribution limits and potentially spending limits.
Why propose such a big shift? What's the problem it's trying to solve?
The stated goal is to combat the influence of wealthy donors and special interests and empower everyday citizens. Proponents argue it would make politicians more responsive to their constituents rather than large donors, and make it easier for candidates without personal wealth or access to rich networks, including more women and people of color, to run viable campaigns.
So it's about shifting the power balance in campaign finance away from big money towards small donors and the public.
That's the fundamental aim, a really ambitious attempt to reshape how congressional campaigns are funded.
Fascinating. Okay, let's move to the final major section of this H.R. 1, government ethics reforms, ensuring public trust in officials, starting with the Supreme Court.
Yes, this bill would require the Supreme Court to adopt a written code of conduct, similar to the codes that bind nearly all other federal judges.
They don't have one now.
They adhere to certain principles, but there isn't a formal binding code specific to them like lower courts have. This aims to establish clear, enforceable, ethical rules for the justices to enhance public confidence.
Seems reasonable. What about strengthening the Foreign Agents Registration Act, ARI?
This aims to give ARA more teeth. It requires people lobbying or doing PR in the U.S. on behalf of foreign governments or entities to register and disclose their activities. This bill would beef up enforcement, creating a dedicated unit in the Justice Department, allowing civil penalties, not just criminal ones, and requiring all ARA filings to be easily accessible online. It's about shining a brighter light on foreign influence efforts.
More transparency on foreign lobbying.
Right.
And lobbying disclosure reform generally.
This broadens the definition of what counts as lobbying to include giving strategic advice intended to influence officials, even if the strategist doesn't make direct contact themselves. It also lowers the dollar threshold for when someone must register as a lobbyist and requires registered lobbyists to disclose their status when they contact high-level officials. Again, aiming for more comprehensive disclosure of who is trying to influence policy.
Closing potential loopholes. Now, presidential ethics. Several items here targeting potential conflicts at the very top.
Right. It includes measures like requiring presidential appointees to recuse themselves from matters where the president or their immediate family has a financial interest, letting career officials handle it instead. It would also restrict federal money from being spent at businesses owned by the president, VP, or cabinet members.
Preventing self-dealing.
That's the idea. It also mandates that any ethics waivers granted to White House officials and a big one. It requires future presidential and VP candidates to release 10 years of their tax returns.
Why are these measures important?
They're all aimed at promoting transparency, preventing conflicts of interest, and ensuring decisions are made for the public good, not personal enrichment, especially at the highest levels. It's about building and maintaining public trust.
Trust through transparency. And finally, strengthening the Office of Government Ethics, the OGE.
Yes. This aims to make the OGE more independent and effective as the executive branch ethics watchdog. It would limit the president's ability to fire the OGE director without cause, grant the OGE authority to conduct its own investigations and issue subpoenas for ethics matters, and clarify that OGE rules apply to everyone in the executive branch, including White House staff. It's about giving the ethics office more power and independence to do its job.
Empowering the watchdog. Okay, one last piece from this version of H.R. 1 that's quite different. Census counting and the residence of incarcerated individuals.
This is a really interesting and impactful provision related to how the census counts population, which in turn affects political representation and funding distribution.
How does it work now, and what would change?
Currently, the Census Bureau counts incarcerated people as residents of the correctional facility where they are housed on Census Day. This bill would change that. It would require the Census Bureau to count incarcerated individuals as residents of their last home address before they were incarcerated.
So count them where they come from, not where the prison is.
Exactly.
Why does that matter?
It matters a lot for political power and resource allocation. The current method can artificially inflate the population counts of often rural communities where large prisons are located. This inflated count can give those districts more clout in state legislatures or even Congress, and a larger share of funding formulas based on population.
Even though the incarcerated people usually can't vote there and have no ties to the community.
Right. Critics call this prison gerrymandering. Counting people at their home address, as this bill proposes, is seen as a way to ensure that representation and resources are allocated based on where people actually live and have community ties, rather than where they are temporarily imprisoned. It aims for a fair distribution of political power and funding.
A fundamental shift in how we count population for representation.
Wow, a very significant change with potentially broad ripple effects on redistricting and funding nationwide.
Well, we have certainly covered a lot of ground today. We took a deep dive into the intricate financial, tax, and healthcare proposals within Title VII of one major H.R. 1 bill.
Really complex stuff in there.
And then we explored the equally critical but very different reforms in the For the People Act version of H.R. 1, focusing on voting, elections, campaign finance, and ethics. It's incredible how much these bills on the Hill can encompass.
It really is. And what's so illuminating, I think, is seeing how these details, a change in a tax credit, a rule about voter registration, how prisoners are counted, can ripple out and have such huge implications for individuals, for communities, and for the whole country.
They're not just abstract words on paper. They're the blueprints for how our society operates, aren't they?
Absolutely. These are the kinds of big, sometimes messy, but ultimately beautiful bills that really shape the world around us.
So as you, our listeners, think about how laws get made and what they actually mean, maybe consider this. How does understanding the specifics, the details, the motivations behind a bill like H.R. 1 in either of its forms change how you might read the news or talk about our government and its future? What other big pieces of legislation out there have puzzle pieces you'd want to deep dive into to really understand their impact?
Lots to think about.
Definitely. Thank you for joining us on the Deep Dive.